The air in Iowa that summer was thick enough to chew. A wet, heavy heat that rose off the cornfields in shimmering waves and stuck your shirt to your back the second you stepped outside. It was the kind of heat that made you lazy, that made you want to find a patch of shade and dream of a cold beer. But there was no time for laziness on August 2nd, 1945. That was the day the children arrived. I remember the sound first. A low grinding of gears and the rumble of diesel engines coming up the long dirt road to Camp Algona. A cloud of fine tan dust followed the convoy of 6x6 trucks like a phantom, coating the leaves of the cottonwood trees and settling on our already grimy uniforms. We stood there, a handful of us guards, squinting against the afternoon sun. Most of us were fathers, uncles, men who knew what a 16-year-old was supposed to look like. They were supposed to be gawky, chasing girls, thinking about baseball or what jalopy they were going to fix up. They weren't supposed to be this. The tailgates dropped with a percussive clang that echoed across the quiet fields, and they filed out. Not a single shove, not a single shouted order from us needed. They formed up in perfect, terrifying ranks. Boys. The oldest couldn't have been more than 17, the youngest maybe 14. His uniform hanging off his bony shoulders. But it was their eyes. I'll never forget their eyes. They were old, ancient, filled with a chilling certainty, a fanaticism that had been hammered into them since they could walk. Among them, one stood out. He was maybe 16, with hair so blonde it was almost white and a jaw that was permanently set. He was Klaus Berger. He didn't just stand at the front, he commanded the front. His gaze swept over us, over the barbed wire, over the neat wooden barracks, and it was filled with nothing but pure, unadulterated contempt. I felt a cold knot tighten in my stomach, a feeling that had nothing to do with the war winding down in the Pacific. We were told these were the last dregs of the Reich, the Hitlerjugend, swept up in the final days. But they didn't look like dregs. They looked like the future of a nightmare. They were expecting brutality. Their propaganda had promised them we were monsters, and they stood there, chests out, chins up, ready to meet their fate with a martyr's pride. My M1 Garand felt impossibly heavy in my hands. We were here to guard children, but looking at them, at the chilling discipline in their ranks and the fire in their eyes, I had the sickening feeling that we were the ones who were truly imprisoned. The first few weeks were a war of silence and contempt. We'd show them to the barracks, clean and dry with actual mattresses. We'd lead them to the mess hall, where the food was hot and plentiful. We followed the Geneva Convention to the letter, but to them it was all a trick, a form of psychological warfare they were determined to resist. Their leader, Klaus Berger, made sure of it. He had created a miniature Third Reich inside our fences. Every morning, before we even did our official count, we'd hear them. The crunch of boots on the gravel in perfect unison. Klaus would be out there, in the pre-dawn gray, barking out commands in harsh German. They'd march. They'd practice drills, using sticks as rifles, their movements sharp and aggressive. They held their own roll calls, maintained a rigid chain of command. They had turned the prison yard into their own private training ground. Their contempt was a physical thing. When we'd pass them, they'd stare right through us, or they'd meet our gaze with a look of such profound hatred it could make your skin crawl. A young private, a kid from Ohio named Miller, tried to be friendly once, offered a boy a stick of gum. The boy just stared at it, then spat on the ground by Miller's feet. Klaus was there in an instant. A quiet word hissed in the boy's ear. I never saw that boy look at one of us again. They had built an iron cage around themselves, but it wasn't made of the barbed wire that ringed the camp. It was forged in their minds, from years of indoctrination. They saw our decency as weakness. The good food was an attempt to soften them. The clean beds were a decadent trap. They were holding on to their ideology like it was the last raft in a shipwreck, and Klaus Berger was the one making sure nobody let go. I used to watch them from the guard tower, this little army of lost boys, and wonder what it would take to breach those walls. Barbed wire, you can cut. A gate, you can unlock. But how do you free a man from a prison he doesn't know he's in? How do you save someone who is convinced you are the devil and that everything you do, every kindness you offer, is just another one of the devil's tricks? It felt hopeless. We were just their keepers, warehousing them until the diplomats figured out what to do. But every day the tension got a little thicker, their self-imposed discipline a little more brittle. Something had to give. The man who started it all wasn't a soldier. He was a cook. Sal Vitale was a first-generation Italian-American from Chicago, a man whose belly shook when he laughed and whose hands were perpetually dusted with flour. He was too old for the draft but wanted to do his part, so he ended up running the mess hall here in the middle of nowhere, Iowa. Sal didn't see prisoners of war. He saw hungry boys. He'd watch them file in, sit ramrod straight and eat his pot roast and mashed potatoes with a grim determination, as if they were consuming poison. He'd just shake his head and mutter in Italian under his breath. One afternoon, during the dead heat of the day, Sal was leaning against the kitchen's screen door, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of his hand. Out in the yard, Klaus had the boys drilling again. Up and down they marched, turning in perfect synchronicity, their stick rifles held at precise angles. They looked like wind-up toys, their faces blank and streaming with sweat. Sal watched them for a long time, a deep sadness in his eyes. He wasn't seeing a fanatic youth army. He was seeing scrawny kids who should be playing, getting into trouble, living a life that hadn't been stolen from them. He turned away from the door without a word and disappeared into the back storeroom. He came out a minute later holding something in his hand. It was an old baseball glove. A Rawlings, dark with age, the leather cracked and supple from 1,000 games of catch. It was a relic from his own youth. I watched him walk out across the yard, not toward the boys, but toward the fence line near their barracks. He didn't say a word. He didn't look at them. He just placed the glove on top of a wooden fence post, resting it there like an offering. Then he turned and walked back to the mess hall. It sat there for an hour, an alien object in their stark world. Eventually, their drills ended and Klaus led them past it on their way to the barracks. He stopped. The whole column stopped behind him. He pointed at the glove with his stick. I was too far away to hear his exact words, but his tone was clear. It was a lecture, a sermon of contempt. He gestured at the glove as if it were a diseased thing, a symbol of everything they were taught to despise. American, decadent, soft, individualistic, meaningless. He sneered. The other boys sneered with him, and they marched on, leaving the leather relic sitting alone on its post, a silent testament to a world they refused to understand. For 2 days, the glove sat on that fence post, baking in the sun. The boys would march past it, their eyes fixed forward, a silent, collective act of will to ignore its existence. But I saw the sideways glances, the flicker of curiosity in the eyes of the younger ones before it was stamped out by discipline. The glove was a question nobody was allowed to ask. The one who broke was a boy named Friedrich. He was small for his age, maybe 15, with big, fearful eyes and a way of trying to make himself invisible. He wasn't a true believer like Klaus. He was a follower, swept up in the tide and now just trying to survive. During a lull in the afternoon, when Klaus was meeting with his little lieutenants in the barracks, Friedrich drifted over to the fence line. He looked around, his movements furtive, like a squirrel stealing a nut. He reached out and touched the glove, just a finger at first tracing the worn stitching. Then he lifted it. He slipped his hand inside. It was too big for him, but he flexed his fingers, feeling the strange, supple leather. He was just standing there, lost in this small, private moment, when Corporal Miller, the same kid who'd offered the gum, saw him from the guard post walkway. Miller was on his break, leaning against the rail, looking bored out of his skull. He saw Friedrich with the glove, and a slow grin spread across his face. He disappeared for a moment and came back with a baseball. On a whim, on an impulse born of boredom and maybe a little bit of pity, he called out. Friedrich jumped, almost dropping the glove, his face a mask of pure terror. He thought he was done for, but Miller just grinned and made a tossing motion. He lobbed the ball underhand, a gentle arc through the hot, still air. Instinct took over. Friedrich, clumsy and awkward, brought the glove up and the ball smacked right into the pocket. The sound, that perfect thwack of horsehide on leather, echoed in the quiet yard. It was a sound of summer, of peace, a sound that had no business being in a POW camp. Friedrich looked at the ball in the glove, then at Miller, a slow, dawning amazement on his face. Miller gestured for him to throw it back. He did, a wild, weak throw that Miller easily snagged. They tossed it back and forth a few more times. A few of the other German boys, drawn by the sound, stopped what they were doing and watched. A small crowd gathered, their faces a mixture of fascination and confusion. They were mesmerized. And that's when Klaus came out of the barracks. The laughter and tentative chatter died instantly. His face was pure thunder. He strode across the yard, snatched the glove from Friedrich's hand and threw it to the ground.
Verräter! Du kollaborierst mit dem Feind. Hast du alles vergessen, wofür wir kämpfen?
I didn't need to speak German to understand. Traitor. Collaborating with the enemy. He dressed Friedrich down in front of everyone, his voice dripping with venom. Friedrich shrank, tears welling in his eyes. The other boys looked away, ashamed or afraid. The spell was broken, but the damage was done. For the first time, I saw a crack, a tiny fracture in the solid wall of their unity. Klaus had restored order, but for a few brief moments, they hadn't been soldiers of the Reich. They had just been boys, watching a game of catch. I reported the incident to the camp commandant, Major Vernon Doyle, that same afternoon. I stood before his desk, cap in hand, and laid it all out. The glove, Friedrich, Corporal Miller's impromptu game of catch, and Klaus Berger's furious reaction. Major Doyle was a career army man, West Point educated, with a face that looked like it was carved from granite. He ran a tight ship, but he wasn't a by-the-book automaton. He listened patiently, his fingers steepled under his chin, his gaze fixed on some point just over my shoulder. When I finished, the office was silent, except for the buzzing of a fly against the window pane and the distant shouts from the yard as Klaus drilled the boys harder than ever. My expectation was that he'd order the glove confiscated, maybe put Miller on report for fraternizing, and double the guard rotations. That's what regulation would call for. That's what any other commandant would do. But Doyle just sat there, thinking. He got up from his desk and walked to the window, looking out at the compound. He could see Klaus marching the boys back and forth in the dust, a pointless, repetitive display of defiance.
So, one boy picks up a baseball glove, and Berger acts like the Reichstag is on fire.
Yes, sir. He called the boy a traitor, humiliated him.
Because he was consorting with the enemy. Because he was engaging in a decadent American pastime.
That's the long and short of it, sir. Major Doyle was quiet for another long minute. I could see the gears turning in his head. He wasn't seeing a security risk as I had. He was seeing something else, an opportunity, an angle.
Sergeant, you said some of the other boys were watching? Fascinated?
Yes, sir. They couldn't take their eyes off it until Berger showed up.
Interesting. Fear is a powerful tool for control, Keen, but so is curiosity. Berger uses fear. Maybe it's time we used curiosity.
Sir?
Get me Sal Vitale. And round up Corporal Miller and anyone else who knows which end of a baseball bat is which. We're going to make this official.
Official, sir? I don't understand.
We're going to have a game. A proper one. Announce it at the morning formation. A team of off-duty American guards and personnel versus any of the prisoners who wish to volunteer. Full supervision, of course. We'll chalk some lines in the dirt. Sal can keep score. It's a gamble, Keen. A big one. It could blow up in our faces. But trying to reason with these boys is like shouting at a brick wall. Their minds are locked shut. Maybe a simple game is the key. Maybe we can't talk them out of the cage, but maybe we can get them to play their way out.
I just stood there, stunned. It was unorthodox, probably against a dozen regulations. But as I looked at the major, and then back out the window at those boys marching toward a future of ruin, I knew he was right. It was a gamble we had to take. The day of the game was hot and tense. Major Doyle's announcement had sent a shockwave through the prisoners' ranks. Klaus had forbidden anyone from participating, declaring it a propaganda trap, and for a while it looked like his order would hold. But then Friedrich, his face still pale from his public shaming, walked out onto the dusty patch of ground we'd designated as a field. Then another boy followed, then 2 more. In the end, about 10 of them stood there, a motley, nervous crew, unable to meet the furious glare Klaus was directing at them from the sidelines. Our team was just as motley. Me, Corporal Miller, a couple of other guards, and Sal Vitale, who insisted on playing first base, his cook's apron tucked into his belt. The game started. It was a comedy of errors. The German boys had never played before. They held the bats like axes, swung at balls a foot over their heads, and ran the bases in the wrong direction. Our guys weren't much better. We were soldiers, not athletes. We fumbled easy grounders and overthrew the ball. But then a strange sound started to bubble up. First a chuckle from Corporal Miller when a German boy swung so hard he spun himself into the dirt. Then one of the German boys laughed when Sal Vitale, running for second base with the grace of a pregnant water buffalo, tripped and had to be called safe. Soon the air, usually thick with tension and hostility, was filled with this alien sound. Laughter. Real, honest-to-God laughter, crossing the lines of language and uniform. It was clumsy, it was chaotic, but it was fun. I stood in the outfield, watching it all, feeling something loosen in my own chest. Klaus watched from the sidelines, a statue of pure contempt. His arms were crossed, his face a mask of thunderous rage. Every laugh from his countrymen was a dagger in his soul, a betrayal of the glorious suffering he demanded of them. He was losing them, and he knew it. The turning point, the moment that I believe broke him, was small and unplanned. It was the bottom of the 4th inning. Friedrich was at bat. He actually managed to hit the ball, a weak little dribbler towards third base. He dropped the bat and sprinted. All arms and legs, his face a picture of grim determination. He was so focused on getting to first that he didn't see a rock in the baseline. He tripped hard and went sprawling in the dust, scraping his hands and knees. The game stopped. For a second, everyone just stared. Then, Corporal Miller, who was covering first base, did something without thinking. He jogged over to Friedrich, offered him a hand, and pulled him to his feet. He brushed the dust off the boy's uniform with a couple of quick pats, smiled, and said something like, "You all right there, kid?" Friedrich, stunned, just nodded. Miller clapped him on the shoulder and trotted back to the base. That was it. A simple, thoughtless, reflexive act of sportsmanship. A gesture of common decency you'd see on any sandlot in America. But I was watching Klaus, and in that moment, I saw his entire world shatter. Every piece of propaganda he had ever been fed, every speech from the Führer, every lesson about the monstrous, subhuman American enemy, it all turned to ash. A monster doesn't help you up when you fall. An enemy doesn't dust you off and smile. In that one simple act, Corporal Miller had dismantled a decade of indoctrination. Klaus Berger's face went slack, the contempt replaced by a profound, horrifying confusion. He turned, and for the first time since he'd arrived, he walked away, his rigid posture gone, replaced by the slumped shoulders of a boy whose god had just died. After that first game, something fundamental shifted in the camp. The baseball games became a regular feature of life, a supervised ritual 3 afternoons a week. More boys joined in, drawn by the sounds of laughter and the simple joy of playing. The rigid discipline of Klaus's little army began to fray and unravel. The boys who played started to look different. The hardness in their eyes softened. They started talking to the guards, asking questions about the rules of the game, about our homes, about America. They learned a few words of English beyond yes and no. They learned good hit and nice catch and hot dog. Klaus was a ghost. He no longer led the drills. He no longer delivered his sermons of hate. He spent most of his days sitting alone by his barracks, staring at nothing. His authority was gone, evaporated in the Iowa heat. The boys he once commanded now just gave him a wide berth, a mixture of pity and fear in their eyes. He was a king without a kingdom, a prophet whose prophecies had been proven false by a baseball and a worn-out glove. Then the news arrived. VE Day was months in the past, a fading headline. Now the Allied powers had finally decided what to do with the millions of German POWs. Repatriation. They were going home. A year ago, this news would have been met with defiant pride. Now, for the boys who played baseball, it was a death sentence. The mood in the camp changed overnight. The laughter was gone, replaced by hushed, terrified whispers. They had seen pictures in Life magazine, read accounts in the newspapers we left in the rec room. They knew what home meant now. It meant rubble. It meant starvation. It meant a country carved up by the victors. For those from the East, it meant the thing their propaganda had always warned them about, the one truth in a sea of lies: the Soviets. I'd walk past their barracks at night and hear them talking. They weren't talking about the glory of the Reich anymore. They were talking about their farms near Leipzig, now in the Soviet zone. They were whispering about stories of German soldiers being shipped to gulags in Siberia. They had tasted a different world, a world of simple kindness, of laughter, of a game where the only enemy was the other team, and even then, he'd help you up if you fell. And now they were being sent back to the nightmare. Klaus remained silent through all of it. The destruction of his ideology hadn't been replaced by a new one. It had been replaced by a vacuum, a terrifying emptiness. The certainties that had defined his entire life were gone, and he was completely, utterly lost. It was a week before the first transport was scheduled to leave. I was in Major Doyle's office, going over repatriation rosters, when there was a hesitant knock on the door. I opened it to find a formal delegation of about a dozen German boys standing in the hallway. At their head was Friedrich. He was holding his cap in his hands, his face scrubbed clean, his expression solemn and desperate. Behind him stood the others, the core of the baseball team. And at the very back of the group, half hidden in the shadows of the corridor, stood Klaus Berger. He wouldn't meet my eye. He just stared at the floorboards, a ghost at a funeral. Major Doyle told me to let them in. They filed into the office, crowding the small space, the smell of clean wool and fear filling the room. Friedrich stepped forward.
"Go on, son."
Friedrich took a deep breath, his knuckles white on the brim of his cap. The words hung in the air, simple and devastating. Major Doyle's face remained impassive, but I saw a flicker of profound sadness in his eyes. Another boy, one of the older ones, spoke up, his voice cracking. They were begging, pleading. These were the children of the master race, the fanatics who had spat at our feet and dreamed of our destruction. Now they were begging to remain our prisoners. The irony was so thick you could taste it. Throughout it all, Klaus said nothing. He just stood at the back, a silent, hollowed-out witness. He didn't join their plea, but more importantly, he didn't stop it. His silence was his confession. His presence was his surrender. Major Doyle let them finish, then he rose from his desk. He walked around and stood before them. His voice was gentle but firm.
"I have heard you, and I understand. But you are soldiers of the German army. The war is over. My orders are to send you home. It is not my decision to make. I am sorry."
Defeated, they filed out of the office as quietly as they had come in. As the last boy left, I looked out the window. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the yard. And I saw Klaus. He had separated from the group and was standing alone by the fence line where it had all begun. He was staring at the old, worn-out baseball glove, which someone had permanently nailed to the post, a kind of monument now. He just stood there, a 16-year-old boy who had lost a war, a god, and a future, all in the space of a summer, left with nothing but the ghost of a simple game of catch. Disclaimer: this video presents a fictional narrative created for entertainment and cautionary purposes. The story, characters, and events portrayed are not real.